Could we see Ocarina of Time HD on the Switch in 2022? What about Wind Waker HD? A Zelda game has been released during every year of the Switch's lifetime so far. Now that the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has been delayed to 2023, it's hard to tell what port could fill the slot for 2022. Through the Nintendo Switch Online service and HD remakes, we can rule out 8 different ports, since all of these games are already playable on the Nintendo Switch. That leaves us with 10 different games that could be all ported onto the Switch in 2022. In this video, I'll be talking about which games are most likely to be ported this year. The most likely games to come over to Switch would be Twilight Princess and Wind Waker HD. These games are two of the very few to still be trapped on the Wii U and are no-brainers to port over because of that. The question is, would Nintendo port over both games in a bundle? Most likely not. Skyward Sword HD was released as a standalone title for a whopping $60. $60! So there's no reason to assume that Twilight Princess and Wind Waker HD wouldn't be released on their own and at the same price as well. Then we need to consider whether or not Nintendo would release both of these games on the same day or separately. The answer is separately. Nintendo wouldn't want to take away from the sales of one 3D Zelda game by releasing another on the same day. So, we would most likely see one of these games released in 2022 and the other several months or even years later. Next, we should consider the potential that the Oracle games have of being ported over to the Nintendo Switch. The only reason these games have such a strong chance of being remade in 2022 is because of the Link's Awakening remake from 2019. The original versions of these 3 games all had similar art styles, so it would be a no-brainer for Nintendo to re-release the Oracle games with reused assets from the Link's Awakening remake sometime this year. The next game to consider is Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures. Both of these games were ahead of their time, utilizing multiplayer without having the technology for it to be convenient. With how easy multiplayer gaming has been made on the Switch, a remake would make the Four Swords games a lot more accessible than they currently are. These games are old and simple enough to be released in a bundle for $60, which is what Nintendo would most likely do. On a similar note, a remake of Triforce Heroes from the 3DS would feel right at home on the Nintendo Switch, though this one is a bit less likely since it is a newer game and is still very accessible on the 3DS. If anything, Nintendo would want to see how the Four Swords games sell first before using their resources to remake such a recent title. That leaves us with Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, Minish Cap, and A Link Between Worlds, all games previously released on handhelds. All 4 of these would be fitting on the Nintendo Switch, but some more than others. The most likely game to be re-released of this bunch is the Minish Cap, a game that made its debut on the Game Boy Advance. This game has been out for the longest amount of time and doesn't specialize in any hardware gimmicks, which makes it a perfect fit for a re-release this year. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, on the other hand, are dependent on the hardware of the DS. Nintendo could still make the games work, but they would need to replace the touch controls with stick controls for Link's movements to make the game playable. Although it would take some extra steps, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks would make 2 welcome additions to the Nintendo Switch. Since these games are smaller 2D titles, I could see them being released in a pack for a total of $60 or separately at $40 each. Finally, there is A Link Between Worlds, my favorite Zelda game. While I would love to see it on Switch, it likely won't be re-released for at least another couple of years given that it was released fairly recently and sold very well. There we have every game that could be ported to the Nintendo Switch console. However, we shouldn't rule out the possibility that we could see a brand new Zelda game in 2022. While this is unlikely, it's not impossible. In my eyes, there are only 4 possibilities for a new Zelda game in 2022. First up is more DLC for Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, a game with a very controversial story. Spoilers for Age of Calamity if you've never played it in 3, 2, 1. Age of Calamity takes place in a different timeline from Breath of the Wild where the heroes win and Link never gets sent into his 100-year-long slumber. Personally, I like this approach, so much that Age of Calamity was my game of the year for 2020, but I know that a lot of people were put off from it. So an interesting add-on to the game would be a DLC storyline about the failures in the Breath of the Wild timeline. This would be neat to see, but since the DLC for Age of Calamity has already ended, it's more likely we'd see a brand new Hyrule Warriors game instead. This new game would cover the war that occurs before the Skyward Sword, or even the Hyrulean Civil War that takes place just before Ocarina of Time. Next, let's talk about the beautiful indie Zelda tie-in game, Cadence of Hyrule. It's such a shame that this game doesn't get talked about anymore. It has to be one of the best 2D Zelda games that I've ever played, and it wasn't even developed by Nintendo. Cadence of Hyrule has some of the most gorgeous pixel art graphics I've ever seen, glorious music, and unique playing style, along with the game dev passion oozing out of every corner of this game. I can't gush about it enough. I would really like to make some separate videos about Cadence of Hyrule. If anyone is interested in that, please let me know in the comments section below, okay? Anyways, enough gushing. Cadence of Hyrule has already received plenty of DLC, so if we were to receive any new content, it would be in a sequel game. Alternatively, we could see a different kind of tie-in Zelda indie game. We all thought that Cadence of Hyrule would mark the start of Nintendo handing their IPs to indie studios more often, yet we haven't seen another game featuring The Legend of Zelda that was developed by another studio on Switch, except Hyrule Warriors, of course. But it would be interesting to see another niche title like this successor to The Crypt of the Necrodancer. I don't have any indie developers in mind, but seeing any sort of niche Zelda game that takes advantage of a unique gameplay concept such as moving along with the music would be great to see. Another possibility is that Nintendo goes ahead and makes a brand new 2D Zelda game, something we haven't seen for a very long time, since 2013 to be exact. A Link Between Worlds was the last and one of the best 2D Zelda games Nintendo has ever released, but after that the focus has been on the new 3D Zelda games and only remakes of the 2D ones. Maybe Nintendo wasn't sure how a 2D Zelda game on Switch would sell, since it would be in competition with the ambitious Breath of the Wild, so they re-released Link's Awakening in 2019. Fortunately, that game did sell well, which opens up the possibility of a brand new 2D Zelda game being released sometime this year. The game could even reuse many of the assets and run in the same engine as the Link's Awakening remake. It's hard to say what this game would be about or where it would fall in the timeline, but it is safe to say that it will feature classic Zelda tropes such as the Triforce, Master Sword, and so on. Or perhaps Nintendo doesn't want to make any more 2D Zelda games and would prefer to take the new Super Mario Bros. Route with that series. If you didn't already know, New Super Mario Bros. Is the series of 2D Mario games that died off when Nintendo began the Super Mario Maker series on the Wii U. We have a whole video all about the death of the new Super Mario Bros. If you're interested in knowing more. The link, I'm going to put it in the description for you. After Mario Maker was released, fans were given the ability to create their own 2D Mario levels, so Nintendo has had no need to create their own 2D Mario games since. It's very possible that Nintendo would take the same route with 2D Zelda, since we do see experimentation with a Zelda Maker that's added in exclusively to the remake of Link's Awakening on the Nintendo Switch. Perhaps Nintendo wanted to see how fans would like to play a 2D Dungeon Maker in Zelda and take any feedback for an eventual Zelda Maker game. They could even reuse a lot of their assets from the bare bones Dungeon Maker that they've already created. With the recent lack of new 2D Zelda games and a 3D one scheduled for next year, now would be the perfect time for Nintendo to release Zelda Maker for the Nintendo Switch. Thanks for watching. If you want to hear us talk about Zelda some more, check out this video, Top 10 Things Breath of the Wild 2 Needs. The link is in the description, of course. Until next time, this has been Danny with Game Domain, and I'll see you in another video.